I take my square piece of paper and then I carefully measure 4 centimeters precisely from each side, and I do this all the way around the entire perimeter, which clearly indicates where my masking tape should go. I then apply the masking tape, smoothly following the lines, and I do this all the way around evenly. And then I make sure that the paper is completely covered. Now I take my first color, which is the light yellow, and then I just gently paint with it. And I take a light green and paint a bit with that as well. And here you can choose whichever color you feel like. This is for painting the flower, which will stand out at the end. So it all depends on what color you want it to be. It can be quite nice to choose some light colors for this. And then in just a moment, we're going to start blending the colors. For that, I use a small piece of paper. It should also be mentioned that it's a really good idea to have some protection down when working with oil pastels, as it can easily get a bit messy since, after all, it's oil pastel. Then I gently blend it all around here. And I just keep doing that continuously, so I don't have those abrupt transitions where there's a bit more of the pastel pigment. So it becomes completely smooth, really even and nice. And I think the pink ended up taking over a bit too much, so that's why I choose to add a bit more yellow to my artwork. And you can just keep going like this until you feel it looks the way you want it to. And I add a bit more green and blend again. And when that's done, I actually put tape over what I just made. And I do this because we're about to make it so that the delicate flower in the middle stands out clearly with sharp lines. So I cover up what I just made, and then I cut across it very carefully. Make sure not to cut into it. It can be a good idea to practice a bit first on our practice sheet, where you learn the techniques. You'll also learn this technique there. You really need to carefully figure out precisely how hard to press to effectively cut through the adhesive tape without also cutting through the delicate paper underneath. So it's all about being very careful, but it's definitely doable and you can absolutely succeed with it. It's better to press a little too lightly so you might not get it all at once and have to cut again, than to press too hard and end up making a hole in the paper. So now I've successfully done that particular step, and then I simply take my chosen dark color and just carefully paint with firm, consistent pressure, moving all the way to the very middle, right across the surface. And here, it just needs to be nicely and thoroughly covered, what I have just carefully painted and applied. And then I take the light color because I want to have a kind of gradient effect there in the middle. And here I also paint with firm pressure, and then I do just like I did with the middle flower. I take some paper and start rubbing. And this is something you just need to work a bit with. You also need to learn the technique for that. And you also have the wonderful opportunity to practice creating beautiful gradients on our comprehensive technique sheet. And here, I think it's becoming a little bit too obvious exactly where I've carefully rubbed with my paper, creating a noticeable mark. So that's why I go over it with a bit more color again. And then I blend once more with the paper to get this smooth transition. And this gives a different expression. Here there are just a few too many lines, so I try again. And it's really about diligently working with the material, carefully manipulating and refining it until you genuinely feel that it looks precisely the way you envision and desire it to look. Following that, I then proceed to add a little bit more of that beautiful blue pigment once again, ensuring the perfect shade and depth. And then I gently take my knife and just loosen the edge so I don't end up rubbing the color too much. That was a small piece I got off there. It just requires me to get a slightly larger piece of tape, and then I can help it along with my hands without rubbing too much of the color around it. I got a bit of tape off there, and then it's really just a matter of continuing until you've removed it all. It's a really nice feeling when it just comes out razor sharp like that. And then I finish by making the stem on my flower. And here my flower has turned out very yellow and light, and in that case I think I would prefer to add a bit more pink than I managed to do here. And finally, we carefully remove the tape we started with, so we get these perfectly sharp edges. And it's also just really satisfying to see your illustration stand out so crisply. So we carefully remove the edges. The masking tape. Just look at how smooth and beautiful it is with this sharp, sharp edge, which really is the finishing touch and makes everything look so nice. And I'll just carefully turn my guide around, making sure it's perfectly aligned, because it's truly a wonderful and satisfying experience to meticulously follow its path all the way through the entire process. It's absolutely the most rewarding and anticipated moment, the very best part, when you finally get to peel off the protective tape and reveal the finished work underneath. It is such a genuine pleasure to be here. Voila, you see, it truly is a delightful experience. Now we're going to start on a landscape, and again I'm just masking off the edge, and here I'm masking so it lines up with the lines, as you can see. Then I take my green and I start by using the technique called stippling. And I do that in this whole area. And it's a very loose technique where you get this somewhat uncontrolled look, which is quite nice. Then I use what's called a hard press around the edge, and you also have the opportunity to practice that on our technique sheets. And I do that all the way around to get this slightly more defined edge, which I really like. And you can do that exactly as you like. And then I just gently give it a few more delicate dabs with this stippling brush, carefully blending it in. And then I basically proceed to do the very same thing underneath, but in this particular instance, I carefully choose a slightly darker shade of green to achieve these distinct and varied shades within the overall landscape. And there I also just use this stippling technique and cover the whole area with it. It's incredibly satisfying to feel this oil pastel just glide across the paper. And the fact that it's a bit uncontrollable allows me to let go of control a little. You just have to enjoy it. It has a life of its own and creates some really, really beautiful textures and such. Now I'm going to utilize this particular palette technique where I carefully take some vibrant color from my oil pastel by gently scraping it off onto the palette, thereby giving it a distinctly different and interesting kind of texture. Here we have what I interpret as being a little lake that I'm coloring, where I start with the light blue and this palette technique, just moving the color around, and it's fine to have a nice thick layer of color. I continue to diligently work with the oil pastel medium, and I basically just keep on going and persist until I genuinely feel that it is precisely the way I truly want it to be. Then I take my white oil pastel and go over it to add some depth and a bit of play in the lake. And again, it's hard to control, and it kind of has a life of its own in a really, really nice and lovely way, where I just get to be in the flow and a little out of control, but in a really good way. Then I will go ahead and meticulously do the sky, and for that particular section, I carefully take my vibrant pink oil pastel and once again try out this distinctive stippling technique, which I also previously used for the various green areas, and I will thoroughly fill it all in completely with that beautiful color. There we go. And now we're moving on to something that's also really fun, and that is we're going to use our stencil. So here I take my stencil, place it on top, and then I choose the color I want to use. And here I want there to be a fence, so I just go over it with the color. And that gives us a really nice sharp look for this fence. Whereas the other part of the illustration is a bit more uncontrolled. Here we have some really sharp lines that create a nice contrast to this wilder coloring. I'll do it again. I want a slightly longer fence, and you can do that exactly as you like. Or maybe you want it to be a tree standing there instead. Then that's just what you do. So it's really just up to what you think yourself. And now I want to make the sun, so I'll take the yellow and just go over it. The pink will blend in when it meets it, so we get a slightly different shade there. And that's it. Then we need to take off our masking tape. And again, it's super cool to see these sharp lines emerge on this oil pastel painting. And then as you look around, you are presented with the most incredibly beautiful and breathtaking landscape imaginable. Yes, there you go. Now we're going to start with one of our more detailed illustrations, and this is this beautiful still life photo featuring a magnificent lobster, along with some fine wine, delicious cheese, luscious grapes, and even some intriguing dice. And again, I start by masking off my edges so I get these sharp lines at the end. And then I start with this masking tape technique, and I choose to do that over the wine bottle where I want the glass of the wine to stand out sharply. So I cut out where I think the glass of the wine goes. The green glass, which is often used for wine. And I cut carefully. Again, it's about not cutting too hard. We don't want to cut through the paper. We only want to cut through the tape. Sometimes it takes a few extra tries. If you're a bit too nervous about pressing too hard, it might be that you haven't pressed hard enough to cut through the tape. It just takes a bit of practice to master it. But once you do, it really creates some incredibly beautiful results. And I do it down here at the bottom as well. Not on the label, but where I truly think, here is precisely where we clearly see the elegant glass of the exquisite wine bottle, and all around the lovely ripe grapes down here. Then I carefully take it off, and after that I put it away. There it actually was. It just doesn't work for me. I'm not cutting quite hard enough, so I'll just take the last bit and do it very carefully again so I can get the last piece of tape off. There we go. And then, with a gentle and deliberate motion, I carefully take it off, lifting it upwards from its position right here at the very top. I make sure to proceed with extreme caution and precision, ensuring that no damage occurs during this delicate removal process. So it really just needs a little extra pressure with the knife. And again, so it's all about finding the balance, not pressing too hard, but also not pressing too lightly with the knife when you cut. And now, at this point, I'm actually ready to begin the process of coloring. And here, in particular, I want a rather kind of bottle green shade, so I'll start with my dark green and then carefully extend it outwards towards the edges and sides. I do that with what's called a hard pressure to really get a lot of color on. And this oil pastel is just so soft to apply. Even though it's called a hard pressure, it hardly feels hard at all because it's so nice to work with. Then I take my light green and work it into the center because I imagine that's where the light hits. And here I also use plenty of color because the dark green would otherwise be dominant. Then I take my paper here and start to graduate and blend. That way I get this lovely surface where you can hardly even tell it's oil pastel, which I think creates a really nice contrast when we start using some of these slightly rougher techniques. And I blend this thoroughly until I truly feel it has precisely the look and the aesthetic quality I ultimately want to achieve. And of course, you can always at any point add a little more color if you genuinely feel it hasn't quite turned out exactly the way you originally wanted it to appear. And you should always remember that it can look a bit intense while the tape is still on, but as soon as you remove the tape and get those sharp lines, what you've blended takes on a completely different look, or graduated if you will. And now I'm just taking a careful look at the guide. Where exactly did I get to? It's really nice and incredibly helpful to have a friend in the process, especially if you need some inspiration or have perhaps forgotten how to do something. And now I'm carefully taking the tape off. And now you can see how great it looks. As soon as the tape comes off, it just has a completely new look because you don't have all that mess next to the lines anymore. Just look at that, it's really nice. And now imagine it next to this slightly rougher oil pastel technique like stippling or scumbling, for example. Then I take my orange color and the lobster, and I do this a bit roughly, starting with the really sharp orange and a bit out towards the edges. And here I also use what's called a hard pressure. It's an advantage not to color the whole lobster, but just start from the top at first. And then we start adding some other colors, so it gets a bit of a three-dimensional effect and doesn't look flat. So now I take a bit of dark yellow and add it to the lobster, just to soften the orange a bit and create some depth. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You get a really, really nice effect just by letting the oil pastel do its work, without worrying too much about staying inside the lines, because that's not what we're aiming for here. That's not the goal. We do that when we use masking tape like we did on the wine bottle. And the contrast of having something that's less outlined just creates something really, really beautiful. And here to finish off the lobster, I'm adding the white, and it's fine if it blends into the other color and blend a little into it. And for everything I paint on the lobster, I use this firm pressure which blends it in. And actually, I don't want to do anything more to the lobster for now. Now I'll start on the background, and here I'm also using firm pressure, so I've chosen to use pink. And it doesn't have to stay within the lines either. It just gives the coolest look when you let the oil pastel do its thing. Like that. And then I add my light yellow, because I think it looks really nice with those two colors next to each other. So I'm using pink, or actually not pink since I've already done that, but now I'm using the light yellow to fill in the remaining squares with firm pressure. And just while you're painting, enjoy it. Enjoy that it doesn't have to be perfect. Enjoy looking at the colors. Fill up your paper. Now we have a background that I personally really like. I'm crazy about these colors. Then I start painting the table that the things are standing on. Here I'm using what's called a scumbling technique, where I move in circles. And I actually do that on this entire layer. And I do it with what's called a light pressure, so I'm not pressing the oil pastel down hard. Here I'm just gently moving with a light or soft pressure, as I've called it in the technique guide. So here I just use soft pressure until the entire base is covered with this lovely technique. And I've chosen this slightly darker yellow. You could call it ochre if you like. I also think it helps to add some depth. Now we have the background with the toes, which is very pastel, and then we have this ochre yellow, which has a bit more depth to it. And then I go around the edges with hard pressure, and I can also see that it creates a bit of depth, some shadow, and a bit of dimension in the picture. Yes, it absolutely creates some really interesting and distinct lines and clear divisions within the overall picture, which genuinely works exceptionally well. I am just using this quite firm, hard pressure on some specific areas of it. Now, what I really want to do is carefully paint my palette knife stick, so to speak, to get the desired effect. And here I just use hard pressure until it's colored in. Then I take the grapes. Here I use this very light green for my grapes. And here I also just use hard pressure. And I'm not focused on staying within any lines. It's okay if it's a bit random. At the same time, it's more or less within where it's shown. Now I'm going to do what's called the graffito effect. Here I start with a light color. In the guide, I actually started with a dark one, but that complicates things quite a bit. So that's why starting with a light color and then adding a dark one on top is always a good idea when working with graffito. And I blend my first layer a bit. And then I put a dark color on top, and here I've chosen this dark red because I think it adds something nice to this picture. And of course you can do it exactly as you like, but it really is a good idea to put a light color underneath and a dark one on top. Then I take my scraping stick and move it upwards. I wipe it off every time I've made a line. Then you can see that the layer underneath appears. I'm just making some lovely, vibrant stripes, and you can absolutely do it exactly as you personally like, whether it's charming checks or something entirely different and unique. I'm carefully making these really nice bright pink stripes because I truly and deeply like the beautiful red and the cheerful pink together so very much. And this could be imagined as a little tablecloth lying here. Now I'm about to make my wine. And for that I take the light green and use what's called a hard pressure where I imagine the wine is. And then I add a bit of white on top because I think it turned out just a bit too light green. So you can always blend a bit of color there. And then I try to create a bit of a glass effect by adding the blue in like this. And I think that's a bit too blue as well, so I add some white. It's really about blending, where it's blending with hard pressure, which is also one of the exercises in the technique. So you get a bit of that glass feeling. And then I have my cheese down here. Now I'll just wipe mine off. You can wipe your oil pastels off from time to time if they've mixed a bit with other colors. So I just wiped off my oil pastel and took off some of the paper, because now I've used up the paper, so you can always just peel off some paper. So that's what I've done. And again here, I think it turned out a bit too yellow, so I'm going over it with white again, just like I did with the wine in the glass. That way I get a slightly lighter yellow color. Finally, I take my trusty black marker and roughly sketch the very top of the bottle with it. I deliberately don't color in the entire thing because that can often be a bit too harsh and visually jarring to look at, but instead, I just gently shade all around it with the black marker, creating a softer effect. And I do precisely the same on the label itself, also applying firm pressure, which is exactly what I am doing here as well. Then, to complete the look, I finish by pretending I've skillfully written something. Personally, I truly think it looks quite nice and adds a charming touch. And then, of course, the distinctive lobster's eye. And now, after all these steps, we actually have a truly finished picture, just the way I had originally envisioned and wanted it to be. You can really do whatever you want with colors and techniques. The only limit is your imagination. This is just my take on what you could do and the way I like it, but there are definitely plenty of other possibilities. So I truly hoped you thoroughly enjoyed following along with me and watching the beautiful oil pastels at their creative work, and that you now feel genuinely inspired and truly encouraged to try this wonderful artistic medium out for yourself. Perhaps we can even do it together, step by step, in the very same order as presented here. And now here are the absolutely finished pictures, ready for your viewing pleasure.